Charleston, 1839. The city was alive with the rhythm of the harbor, wooden masts groaning under the weight of trade, carriage wheels clattering over cobblestone, and the low hum of voices blending with the cries of gulls above the water. By daylight, it was a place of elegance and order, women in lace parasols, men in linen coats, and servants moving like shadows beneath the grandeur of it all. But when night came, the same streets grew quiet, as though the air itself was holding its breath. And in that silence stood a house that refused to stay silent. It rose 3 stories high near the edge of the harbor, its shutters painted deep green, its iron gates cold with salt. By day, it seemed like any other grand Charleston mansion, but at night, those who passed claimed they heard a sound from within. Some said it was a voice. Others swore it was the sea pressing against the walls, whispering through the cracks. No one knew for certain. But everyone agreed on one thing: once you heard it, you never forgot it. Locals called it the Wainwright House. The man who owned it, Elias Wainwright, was one of the wealthiest men on the coast. His ships moved like floating fortresses, carrying rice, cotton, and human lives. He had inherited everything from his father, and in turn, expected to leave behind a name that would never fade. But the name Wainwright did not become famous for its riches. It became whispered for its silence. Old dockhands told stories about Elias, that he was polite but cold, that he spoke little, and when he did, his words carried weight like iron. He was said to dine alone most nights, though he was never entirely alone. In that house, there was always someone with him. Someone the townsfolk rarely saw, but everyone had heard of, a woman named Mara. No one knew where she came from. Some said she was from one of his plantations upriver, others claimed she arrived by ship, chained but untouched by fear. What set her apart was her silence. She never spoke, never sang, never cried. Elias, it was said, demanded it. Servants were told not to speak her name, and guests were never to mention her presence. Yet even with her silence, or perhaps because of it, she became the most talked about person in Charleston. The house staff whispered that Mara had once been a singer, a voice so pure it could hush a crying child or still a storm. Elias had forbidden her to use it. Some claimed he was jealous of her gift. Others believed her silence was her rebellion, the only power she had left. Then one summer night, something changed. The heat had hung over the harbor for days, pressing against the skin, thick and heavy. The sky turned the color of bruised copper. The tide swelled higher than usual, and a storm rolled in, sudden and furious. That was the night the whispering began. No one could explain it. The servants heard it first, faint murmurs in the walls, like someone speaking from behind the plaster. Then came the soft hum, a woman's voice, low and slow, rising with the sound of the wind. They said it came from the attic, though the attic had long been locked. When morning came, Mara was gone. Elias told the overseers she had run away in the storm. But those who knew the ground said that was impossible. The iron gates were locked, the dogs chained, and the mud outside showed no footprints. She had vanished without a trace, no sound, no struggle, no sign of escape. The next night, Elias sat alone in the dining room. The wind rattled the shutters, the candles trembled, and from somewhere deep in the house came a single note, a voice humming, soft and distant. He froze. It was a tune he knew well, a lullaby he once demanded she never sing again. Neighbors began to talk. Servants refused to enter certain rooms after sunset. The maid said mirrors fogged by themselves. The cook claimed she found words written in dust across the table, "I am still here." Elias dismissed it all as superstition, but the longer he tried to ignore it, the worse it became. The whispering grew bolder. The air in the halls seemed to carry breath that was not his own. Some nights, the neighbors saw candlelight flickering in the attic windows, though no one had been up there in years. And then came the smell of salt. Even with the doors sealed, the scent of seawater crept through the house, strong, briny, like the harbor itself had flooded the foundation. When Elias followed it to the cellar, he found puddles glistening under the lantern's glow. But when he looked closer, he realized it wasn't water. It was something thicker, darker, something that shouldn't have been there at all. From that night on, Elias stopped sleeping. He roamed the corridors until dawn, muttering under his breath, always listening, always waiting. The servant said he started locking every door, sealing windows shut, demanding silence from everyone. But no matter how quiet he made the house, the whispers never stopped. And Charleston began to take notice. Merchants in the harbor would glance toward the Wainwright estate and swear they saw a shadow pacing the balcony, a woman's shape against the lantern light. Fishermen crossing the bay late at night heard what they described as a voice calling their names, carried on the tide. No one dared walk past the house after dark. In a city where secrets were currency and appearances were law, people had learned not to question what they could not explain. But in the case of Elias Wainwright's house, silence had become too loud to ignore. And so the legend began, a story told in hushed tones by dockworkers, whispered by children near the harbor, and written in no official record. The story of a house that remembered. A master who could not forget. And a voice that refused to die. Elias Wainwright was a man whose wealth could buy almost anything, and yet, it seemed, the one thing he truly desired was something no amount of gold could touch. His ships ruled the Carolina coast, his warehouses overflowed with goods, and his name opened every door in Charleston's high society. He walked among judges, traders, and governors with an ease that came from generations of power. But beneath his polished civility lay something unspoken, a hunger that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with control. Elias was a man who built his fortune not on risk, but on possession. Every crate, every field, every life he owned was catalogued, watched, and kept within reach. Other planters sold and traded the people they enslaved as though they were currency. Elias did not. He kept them all, even when it made no profit, even when his overseers urged him to sell. He claimed it was for stability, but those who worked for him whispered it was for something else. Something personal. Those who served closest to him said that the master had certain rules about speech. In his house, no one was to raise their voice, not even in pain. He claimed noise disturbed the order of his thoughts. But the longer his rules held, the quieter the estate became. Laughter disappeared first, then song, until even the children learned to move in silence. The house became a cage of whispers, every sound weighed, every breath measured. At the center of that silence was Mara. No one could say exactly when she first appeared in the household records. Her name was written in faded ink between the lines, as though it had been added after the list was complete. She was young, with eyes that seemed to know more than she ever allowed to show. Those who saw her said she carried herself with a stillness that unsettled people, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, not broken. Elias gave her work inside the main house. First in the kitchen, then as an attendant, then as something else entirely. She became a shadow at his side, present in rooms she was not meant to enter, moving in and out of sight like a thought he couldn't shake. Servants learned to step aside when she passed, for fear of drawing the master's attention. Some of the field hands said they once heard Elias speaking to her late at night. Not shouting, not commanding, but pleading. His voice would rise, tight with frustration, while hers remained steady and calm, though she never spoke a word back. It was said that when she looked at him, he flinched, as if seeing himself reflected in her silence. The more she refused to speak, the more his obsession grew. He built her a small room at the far end of the hall, away from the others. The key never left his pocket. She ate separately, slept alone, and was forbidden to leave the house without his approval. And yet, despite his control, she never seemed afraid. There were nights when she stood at the window, facing the harbor, her expression unreadable. Some swore they saw her mouthing words to the water, as if confiding in it. Elias became convinced that she was hiding something from him, a truth, a secret, a memory that her silence protected. He began to watch her constantly, even at meals, as if waiting for her to break. He asked questions only she could answer, then grew furious when she gave no reply. Some nights, the servants heard him pacing outside her door, muttering to himself, promising rewards if she spoke and punishments if she did not. But Mara's silence held. And with it, the house began to change. The servants noticed that Elias had stopped entertaining guests. He no longer visited the harbor or his warehouses. His letters went unanswered. Even his business associates complained that he had become difficult, distracted, withdrawn, unpredictable. They said he would pause mid-sentence, as if hearing something no one else could. Then, one evening, when the sun was sinking behind the harbor and the air smelled of salt and smoke, Elias was seen standing on the balcony, staring out toward the sea. He stayed there for hours, unmoving, his hand clutching the iron railing until his knuckles went white. When his overseer approached, Elias said only one thing: "She's hiding something from me." After that night, the rules of the house grew harsher. Doors that had once stood open were locked. The servants were ordered never to speak above a whisper. Meals were taken in silence. And yet, the stillness inside those walls no longer felt like obedience, it felt like waiting. The overseer, a man hardened by years of cruelty, confessed years later that he had begun to fear his master. Not for what Elias might do, but for what he might already have done. There were times, he said, when he heard Elias talking softly through the floorboards, as if speaking to someone beneath him. And sometimes, when he passed by Mara's locked door, he could swear he heard her humming, faint, distant, and calm, as though the house itself was breathing with her. Elias Wainwright was a man of reason, a man of commerce, but in that year, reason had left him. What remained was an obsession, not for love, not for faith, not even for control, but for silence itself. And soon, that silence would answer him back. It began with heat, the kind that makes the air feel heavy, the kind that carries warning. Charleston simmered beneath a sky that would not darken, clouds gathering but refusing to break. The harbor smelled of iron and brine, and the streets fell into an uneasy quiet. People said even the gulls had gone still. For 3 days the city waited for the rain that never came. Inside the Wainwright house, that waiting felt sharper. The servants moved slower, glancing at the windows as if expecting them to shatter. Elias himself seemed restless, pacing through his halls, his shirt open at the throat, his face drawn with sleeplessness. He spoke to no one. He wrote nothing. The only sound in the house was the ticking of the grandfather clock, steady, relentless, echoing through rooms that once felt alive. That evening, the sky finally broke. The storm came without warning. Wind tore through the harbor, bending palms nearly to the ground. Waves slammed against the docks with the force of cannon fire. Lightning split the air over the rooftops, turning the harbor into a field of sudden, violent light. The servants scrambled to shutter windows and bar doors. Elias shouted orders over the thunder, demanding that every room be secured. But in the chaos, someone noticed a door at the far end of the hall swinging open, the one that led to Mara's quarters. Her room was empty. Her bed remained untouched. The small wooden comb she used sat by the basin. A candle had burned itself down to a stub. The window was closed, the lock still in place. It was as if she had simply stepped out of existence. Elias's voice carried through the storm that night. He ordered the grounds searched, though the rain fell in sheets so thick that even lanterns could barely pierce the dark. The overseers waded through the flooded yard, calling her name into the wind, but there was no answer. Only the roaring sea. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the city drenched and dazed. The sun rose on a harbor littered with debris, driftwood, torn sails, and fragments of what had been homes near the shore. Inside the Wainwright house, the master sat in his study, soaked through, his eyes vacant. When the overseers asked for orders, he told them there would be no search. "She's gone," he said, his voice hollow. "She chose it." But those who lived in the house knew better. On the third night after the storm, the cook woke to the sound of something faint, a low humming, coming from the direction of the well. She thought it was the wind, until she realized the melody was too steady, too deliberate. It was a tune that no one had sung in that house for years. She ran to tell the others, but when they gathered around the well, the sound had stopped. Only the water moved, calm and dark. 2 nights later, the sound returned, this time from the attic. A whisper, soft, rhythmic, almost like someone speaking through the boards. When they brought lamps to look, they found nothing but dust and old furniture. Yet, as they turned to leave, the whisper rose again, this time behind them. The maid who carried the light swore she felt breath on her neck. Elias heard of it by morning. His face turned gray when they told him. He forbade them from mentioning her name again, not in the house, not on the grounds. He claimed their imaginations were diseased by grief, that the mind could play tricks after tragedy. But that afternoon, as he crossed the upstairs corridor, he stopped mid-step. There it was, her voice. Faint, drifting just beyond the reach of hearing, as if someone were standing on the other side of the wall. He called out, certain someone was mocking him. No answer. He pressed his ear to the plaster. The voice was there, humming, calm, the same tune she had once used to quiet the children on the estate. He struck the wall with his cane until the sound stopped. After that, the house became a prison of noise and silence tangled together. Doors creaked when no one touched them. The chandeliers trembled though the air was still. Some claimed they heard footsteps crossing the attic at midnight, slow, measured, as though pacing. One of the maids collapsed after claiming she saw a shape standing at the end of her bed, watching her in the dark. Elias began sealing the house. He ordered the windows boarded, the attic nailed shut, the cellar locked. He dismissed the staff one by one, saying too many tongues made the walls restless. He burned Mara's linens, her clothes, even the small cross she once wore on a thread around her neck. The ashes drifted across the courtyard like black snow. But the voice would not die. Each night it returned, sometimes humming, sometimes whispering words too soft to catch. The few remaining servants refused to sleep indoors. They built small fires outside the kitchen and stayed there until dawn, refusing to look back at the dark windows behind them. Elias, left alone in the silence he once demanded, began to unravel. He stopped eating. He stopped shaving. He moved through the house with a lantern in his hand, searching corners for a sound that never showed itself. Those who saw him from the street said he looked less like a man and more like an echo, something hollow, walking through the memory of a life that had already ended. And somewhere, deep in the walls of that house by the harbor, the whisper continued, steady, patient, unbroken. Because though Mara had vanished from sight, her voice had not gone with her. It had found a way to stay. By autumn of that year, Charleston had begun to whisper again, not about the storm, not about trade, but about the Wainwright estate. The neighbors said the house was sick. Some claimed it moaned at night, others that it breathed. The church could no longer ignore the talk. To preserve calm and reputation, they decided that something must be done. So they sent Reverend Josiah Holt. He was a young minister, recently arrived from the Low Country, a man of delicate build and quiet faith. He believed in order, in reason, and in the triumph of Scripture over superstition. When he was told that the Wainwright house suffered from unnatural disturbances, he did not laugh, but neither did he tremble. A home cannot be haunted, he told his parishioners. Only the hearts within it can be. The Reverend arrived at dusk, his carriage wheels crunching over the gravel drive. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. No birds sang. Even the crickets were silent. Elias met him at the door, pale and sleepless, his once smooth hands now shaking as he gestured the Reverend inside. "Thank you for coming," Elias said. His voice was thin, brittle. It began with a voice. "I thought it was memory. But memory doesn't open doors." Reverend Holt studied him for a moment, then looked beyond into the vast hall. The house was immaculate but lifeless, as though the walls had been polished to hide what they had witnessed. Every mirror was covered in cloth. The air was still, but not calm, the kind of stillness that holds its own breath. The Reverend began his work with prayer. He carried holy water, candles, and a worn Bible. He asked to speak to the enslaved people of the household, hoping to understand what they had heard. But when he called them forward, they refused to answer. Some kept their heads bowed, others wept quietly, but not one spoke. Elias grew impatient. "They're frightened by stories," he said. "Tell them it's nonsense." But the Reverend sensed something deeper than fear. There was a look in their eyes that spoke of knowing, of things they had seen and would not name. That night, as the candles burned low, Holt began his cleansing. He walked the halls, sprinkling water along the baseboards, whispering verses. He moved through the parlor, the dining room, the servants' quarters, each step echoing louder than the last. The silence of the house seemed to follow him, pressing close behind. When he reached the master's quarters, Elias hesitated. "Do not enter that room after dark," he warned. But the Reverend insisted. "If there is something here, it must be faced." Elias unlocked the door. The smell hit first, faint, metallic, like rain on rust. The air inside was colder than the rest of the house, heavy, motionless. The candles flickered though there was no draft. Reverend Holt stepped forward, reading from his Bible, his voice shaking but steady. As he began the final prayer, the room responded. The temperature dropped sharply, the flame on his candle drew long and thin, bending toward the far wall. A faint mist gathered across the surface of the mirror beside the bed. Holt turned toward it, still reading. His reflection wavered. Then, slowly, words began to form in the fog. 2 words, written in the careful hand of a woman. "He lied." The Reverend froze. The ink of his voice died in his throat. Behind him, Elias whispered something too low to catch. Holt turned, but Elias was already backing away, eyes wide, face bloodless. The mist on the glass deepened, spreading across the surface like breath on winter air. And as it did, the faint outline of a hand appeared, pressed flat against the other side of the mirror. The Reverend stumbled back, dropping his candle. The flame sputtered, caught the edge of his sleeve, and died in the damp air. He snatched his Bible, muttering verses he no longer believed would help, and fled the room. The last thing he saw before the door slammed behind him was the hand sliding down the glass, leaving a streak as though it had been reaching toward him. He didn't stop running until he reached the carriage. By morning, his Bible was found lying open on the floor of the master's quarters, pages soaked through, words blurred. The verse it had fallen to spoke of truth revealed through fire and silence, though none could say whether that was choice or chance. Elias ordered the mirrors removed that same day. Every last one, from the hall, the parlor, the bedrooms, even the servants' quarters. He demanded they be taken out and buried. The workers obeyed without question. But that night, when the last mirror was gone, they swore they could still see reflections on the walls, faint, moving shapes where glass had once hung. Reverend Holt left Charleston the following week. He gave no sermon, spoke to no one, and boarded a ship bound north. Those who saw him at the dock said his hands still trembled, as though holding something he could not set down. And in the house he left behind, the silence returned, heavier than before. Because when truth is written in mist, it never fully fades. Winter settled slowly over Charleston, the harbor coated in fog that clung to the masts like pale cloth. The city moved quietly through the season, though the Wainwright house stood apart, its shutters closed, its gates locked, its chimneys releasing no smoke. People passed it without looking, as if the act of seeing might draw its attention. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Most of the staff had gone. Only a few remained, too old to leave, too frightened to speak. They said Elias rarely came out of his study now. When he did, he spoke to no one. He moved like a man half buried, kept alive only by habit. And then, one morning, the silence broke. The overseer had gone to the cellar to fetch firewood when he heard it. A sound soft and steady, like breathing, coming from beneath the floor. He thought it a trick of the wind at first, until he heard something else, a faint rustle, a sigh, and then a tiny, steady movement. When he pulled the boards aside, he froze. There, nestled in the dirt beneath the foundation, lay a bundle wrapped in burlap. The cloth was damp, but the thing inside moved. He knelt, peeled the fabric open, and saw a child, newborn, impossibly quiet, staring up at him with eyes too wide for its small face. The overseer staggered backward, crossing himself. He ran to fetch Elias, who appeared moments later, barefoot, his coat half-buttoned, a look of disbelief and terror twisting his face. He stared at the child for a long time, saying nothing. Then he bent down, touched the edge of the burlap and whispered, "Who left you here?" The baby did not cry. It only blinked once, slowly, and fixed its gaze on him. Elias ordered the servants to bring warm water, milk, blankets. He refused to let anyone else hold the child. He named him Jonas, no surname, no record of birth. When asked where the infant had come from, Elias said only that Providence had sent him. But the servants had their own thoughts. They remembered Mara. They remembered her disappearance, the storm, the voice that still whispered through the walls. And when they saw the child's eyes, dark, still, unblinking, they whispered her name again, though quietly, so the master would not hear. The likeness was unmistakable. From the day Jonas was found, Elias changed. His temper grew unpredictable. He barked orders at empty rooms, shouted in the night, and sometimes went days without eating. Once, a maid caught him standing at the foot of the cellar stairs, muttering to himself, asking a question no one could hear, and then answering as if someone had spoken back. He began sleeping with lamps lit, as though darkness itself had turned against him. And when the servants sang at their work, he forbade it. "No music," he said. "Not in this house. Not anymore." He claimed it unsettled the child. But music returned regardless. At first, it came faintly, a hum under the floorboards, barely louder than the creak of the house settling in the cold. Then it grew stronger, threading through the rooms at night. It was the same tune the servants had once heard in the well, the same that had drifted through the attic months before. A woman's voice, low, slow, and steady, carrying the softness of a lullaby. The maids refused to enter the nursery after dark. They said the cradle rocked on its own, that the air there never warmed, no matter how many fires were lit. The child never wept, never reached out, never smiled. He only watched the corners of the room, eyes following something no one else could see. One night, Elias burst into the servants' quarters, wild-eyed, demanding to know who had been singing. None confessed. He accused them all, shouting that they wanted to drive him mad. But as he spoke, the sound came again, drifting through the ceiling, clear and tender, right above his head. Every face turned toward the sound. Elias's voice faltered. He ran upstairs, tore open every door, and found nothing. The halls were empty. Only the lullaby remained, echoing through the beams, fading as quickly as it came. From that night onward, he refused to sleep in the same room twice. He moved from chamber to chamber, carrying the child with him as though keeping it close would silence the noise. But no matter where he went, the melody followed. The overseer, who had served the Wainwrights since boyhood, said later that the master had begun to speak of Mara again, not as a ghost, but as though she had never left. He claimed she visited the house each night to see her son, and that if he could only keep Jonas safe, she would forgive him. The staff started to leave one by one. Those who remained avoided the cellar, avoided the nursery, avoided Elias. The house became hollow, its corridors filled with echoes. And yet, every night, when the city grew quiet and the tide rose against the harbor wall, the same lullaby drifted up from beneath the floor, a voice that should not have been there, singing to a child who would not cry. Jonas grew, but he did not change. His eyes stayed dark and watchful, his face calm. And in that calmness, Elias saw both comfort and accusation. The master who had once ruled with command now flinched at shadows. He stopped speaking of business, stopped writing letters, and rarely left his house. The world outside forgot him. But inside those walls, the whispering did not stop. Because something had been born beneath that house, something that carried a name that could no longer be spoken aloud. And it had come into the world with silence in its lungs. By the spring of 1841, the Wainwright estate had become a place of quiet dread. The shutters, always closed, gave the illusion that no one lived there. But sometimes, in the deep of night, a single lamp would burn in the upper rooms, a faint, unsteady glow that never seemed to move. Those who walked past claimed to hear two voices drifting through the open cracks, one low, deliberate, and masculine, the other, soft, faint, like the hush of someone speaking through water. Elias had begun taking in occasional travelers, men from the docks, merchants, or visiting partners from Savannah who sought his patronage. They would dine with him, toast his success, and retire to the guest rooms, grateful for the master's hospitality. But many left the next morning pale and shaken, muttering half-formed things about dreams they could not recall. And then came those who didn't leave at all. The first was a sailor, a quiet man who claimed to have known Elias from his shipping ventures years before. He spent one night in the east room. The servant said he went to bed after supper, speaking to no one. At dawn, his bed was empty, the sheets undisturbed, the window locked from within. A week later, another guest, a trader from New Orleans, burst from his room before dawn, shouting for help. His face was wet with sweat, his voice hoarse. He swore that a woman had been standing at the foot of his bed, holding a child, watching him in silence. When he shouted, she did not move, she only raised one hand, as if to hush him. Then she was gone. Elias dismissed him, saying the man had drunk too much. But the servants whispered that the trader left Charleston that very morning and never returned. After that night, word spread through the city. The house had become a place of hauntings. People said the woman who appeared to visitors was the same Mara who had vanished 2 summers before. Some said her spirit was searching for her son. Others said she was waiting for Elias to confess. The final straw came when Dr. Thaddeus Clark, a respected physician and old acquaintance of the Wainwrights, arrived at the estate. He was known for his curiosity, a man who prided himself on logic, not fear. Clark had heard the stories and saw them as an opportunity, a chance to expose what he believed was deception. At supper, he pressed Elias with questions, about Mara, about the boy, about the strange noises the neighbors spoke of. Elias responded calmly, too calmly, each answer clipped and precise. When the doctor accused him of hiding something beneath the house, Elias's hand froze around his glass. He smiled, but his eyes did not. That night, the doctor was shown to his room. He was heard pacing for hours, then silence. 2 days later, his carriage was found abandoned by the marshes, the horses drowned in the shallow water, still hitched to the cart. His medical bag lay in the mud beside the wheels. There was no sign of him. Elias sent no men to search. He did not visit the sheriff. When asked, he said only, "The doctor left before dawn." He had his reasons. The city began to murmur. The Charleston Gazette published a brief notice, "Local physician presumed lost to the tides." But in the taverns, at the markets, and among the church pews, people said otherwise. They said Elias Wainwright's fortune had outlived its source. That his ships returned full while others foundered. That his name was spoken in ports where no man of faith would trade. They said he no longer dealt in goods, but in promises, bargains made in silence. And when night fell over the harbor, and the tide crept higher against the seawall, the people of Charleston could sometimes hear a hum rising from the Wainwright estate, faint but distinct, like the echo of a woman's voice carried through the mist. Those who dared to listen swore the voice was not crying. It was singing. And within that song, if one listened closely enough, was a name. A name Elias had forbidden to be spoken aloud. The August air was thick enough to taste, heavy with salt, swollen with the heat that never lifted from the harbor. The crickets had gone silent that night, and even the tide seemed to hesitate, as if the whole city was holding its breath. Inside the Wainwright estate, the lamps burned low. Most of the servants had long since retired, leaving only the overseer awake, keeping uneasy watch in the corridor outside Elias's room. It had been months since the doctor's disappearance, and the house had grown quieter with every passing week, not with peace, but with something closer to waiting. Then, just past midnight, a sound began. It started faint, a metallic scrape across the floorboard somewhere deep in the house. The overseer sat upright, thinking it was the wind. But it came again, heavier this time, slower, deliberate. Like something being dragged. Chains. The sound moved through the walls, across the lower hall, then up toward the east wing. The overseer stood frozen, listening as the noise climbed the stairs, dragging, pausing, dragging again. Each pull sounded closer than the last, until it seemed to come from just beyond the corridor. He ran to wake the other servants, but before he could speak, Elias's door flew open. The master stepped out barefoot, his nightcoat open, eyes wide and bloodshot. He had heard it too. "Find it," he hissed. His voice cracked on the word. "Find where it's coming from." The overseer nodded, though his hands trembled. The two men took lanterns and moved through the hallways. Every sound of the chain seemed to retreat as they approached, only to start again once their backs were turned. When they reached the cellar door, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The door was bolted from the outside, heavy iron, cold to the touch. Elias stared at it, breathing hard. "Who locked it?" he demanded. No one answered. The servants exchanged glances, but none dared speak. "Open it," Elias ordered. The overseer hesitated. "Sir, the lock's been sealed for months." "Open it." With shaking hands, the overseer pulled back the bolt. The instant the door cracked open, a rush of air burst outward, so sudden and sharp that every lantern flame in the hall went out. The sound was not wind. It was a gasp, deep and guttural, like the first breath of something long buried. Elias stepped forward, holding his lantern high. The light flickered over stone walls slick with moisture, over old crates, and the faint glint of rusted metal scattered across the floor. And there, at the center of the room, lay a single length of chain, thick, black, broken clean in half. No body. No struggle. Just the chain, and a hollow in the dirt where something had once been anchored. Elias dropped to his knees. The lantern trembled in his hand. "Mara," he whispered. "You said you would forgive me." The overseer watched, paralyzed. He wanted to speak, to pull the man away from the doorway, but something in the air held him still. A coldness that pressed against his chest, that seemed to hum with memory. Then Elias began to mutter, fragments, words too low to catch. His lips moved faster, his voice cracking, rising. "She was never meant to, no, I gave her everything." He reached toward the chain as if to touch it, but his hand stopped short, trembling inches above it. The light from his lantern dimmed, the wick sputtering, and for one heartbeat the room fell into complete darkness. When it flared back to life, Elias was on the floor. The overseer rushed to him, no wound, no mark, just the faint look of someone who had seen too much. His eyes were open but distant, fixed on the ceiling as though watching something drift away. They carried him upstairs, laid him in his bed, and lit every candle in the house. All night, the servants kept watch. His chest rose and fell shallowly, his hands clenched around the blanket as if gripping something unseen. Just before dawn, a single whisper passed through the house, faint as breath, but clear enough that all who heard it froze in place. It was a woman's voice. And she said only one word. "Rest." When the first light came through the shutters, Elias Wainwright was gone. No wound. No struggle. His body simply ceased, cold, still, and untouched, as if whatever had claimed him had not needed to break him, only called him home. By morning, the house stood empty. No one spoke of what had happened. The overseer packed his things and left before sunset. The servants followed by the next day. Charleston awoke to the news that Elias Wainwright, once one of its richest men, had died quietly in his sleep. But those who had heard the chains that night knew sleep had nothing to do with it. They said the master of the Whispering House had finally answered the voice that had never stopped calling his name. The house lingered long after Elias Wainwright's death, a shell of its former self, but still standing, its bones too stubborn to fall. The shutters stayed drawn, the gardens overgrown, the gates chained shut. Only one figure remained within its walls, the boy, Jonas. He was 10 by then, small for his age, with the same stillness that had marked him since birth. The townsfolk said he had inherited his father's silence, but those who had known Elias knew better. The boy's quiet was not born of discipline or grief, it was listening. Always listening. He lived among the few old servants who had stayed behind out of duty or fear of what might happen if the house were left alone. They said the child would wander for hours without speaking, tracing his fingers along the walls as if reading something written there. Sometimes he would stop in front of a door that led nowhere, one of the old sealed chambers from the days Elias forbade certain rooms to be opened. He would stand very still, tilt his head, and smile faintly. Once, the cook found him standing before the bricked-up parlor, his hand pressed against the cold plaster. When she asked what he was doing, he said, "She's singing again." "Who?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "The woman who hums," Jonas said. Then he turned and walked away as if the question itself had been foolish. The servants began to watch him more closely after that. He would wake in the night and move through the corridors barefoot, stopping at places no one had stepped in years, the cellar door, the window overlooking the marshes, the cracked mirror left in the attic. When confronted, he would only say, "She wants me to follow." He spoke of her, often, though never with fear. To him, she seemed not a ghost, but a guide. He never cried, never shouted, and when storms shook the house, he would sit at the foot of the stairs, humming softly, the same tune his father had once tried so hard to silence. The servants noticed something else: the boy never forgot the words he wasn't supposed to know. He could recite names long erased from the ledgers, repeat verses from a Bible that no one had read to him, hum songs that no living person had ever taught. Once, the overseer, now a frail old man, asked him if he remembered his father. Jonas thought for a long time before answering. "He's quiet now," he said. "But she isn't." The house responded to him. The air changed when he entered a room. Fires burned steadier in his presence, clocks that had stopped began to tick faintly when he passed. The servants began to whisper that the boy was the true heir of the house, not to its wealth, but to its silence. And sometimes, when the wind rolled in from the harbor and the house groaned with the weight of its memories, those who still lived there could hear him humming in the halls, low, steady, and certain. It was the same song his mother had once sung through the walls. The lullaby that had never stopped. And though Jonas never spoke of her again, every step he took echoed with her rhythm, every breath carried her name, unspoken but alive, the woman who hummed. When word of Elias Wainwright's death spread beyond Charleston, his distant relatives came like vultures circling a forgotten feast. They arrived in polished carriages, dressed in mourning black, their voices hushed in public and greedy in private. To them, the Wainwright house was not a monument or a tomb, it was opportunity. The will was vague. No mention of heirs. No clear instructions on what was to become of the estate. Only silence, written as carefully as Elias had lived it. So the relatives decided for themselves. They would sell it all, the land, the house, the furnishings, even the remaining enslaved workers who had been too frightened or too loyal to flee. An auction was arranged, and by morning the front lawn filled with wagons and strangers. The air was heavy with humidity, the smell of salt and rot rising from the marsh. The auctioneer, a man known for his booming voice, climbed the porch steps and began his calls. The first lot, furniture. Ornate chairs, imported rugs, a grand mirror from France. The bidding went smoothly, until the winning bidder, a merchant from Savannah, collapsed where he stood. His body stiffened, his eyes rolled back, and within moments he was gone. The doctor declared it a seizure. The relatives insisted the sale continue. The second lot, silver, crystal, fine china. Halfway through, one of the bidders began coughing violently, clutching his throat as though choking on nothing. He was carried off, gasping, his skin pale as wax. The overseer, who had seen the house at its darkest, warned them to stop. "It's not finished," he said quietly. "The house don't like to be sold." They ignored him. On the third day, they auctioned the enslaved, men and women who had worked the estate for decades. As the first name was called, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. Wind howled across the marsh, and thunder rolled though no rain fell. When the auctioneer opened his mouth to call the next bid, his voice broke mid-word. He stumbled, grabbed his chest, and fell dead where he stood. The sheriff, standing among the crowd, removed his hat and muttered, "Coincidence." But no one answered. The silence that followed felt too heavy, too knowing. By dusk, the crowd dispersed. The relatives locked the gates and swore to finish the sale another day, but none returned. Every buyer who had signed their name that morning fell ill within the week, fever, coughing, or simply never waking. Word spread through Charleston faster than any ledger could record: the Wainwright estate was cursed. The sheriff tried to investigate, but his deputy refused to step through the door. Even the enslaved people left behind begged to be sold elsewhere, whispering that the house itself was alive. Listening, remembering, waiting. By winter, the gates rusted shut. The windows were nailed, the doors chained, and the property abandoned. Vines crept across the veranda, and moss smothered the marble steps. Yet, the house was never still. Fishermen passing through the harbor at night swore they saw a faint light in the upper windows, a single candle in the attic, burning long after midnight. It would flicker, fade, and return again, as though someone were pacing slowly beneath the roof. One sailor claimed he heard a sound with it, soft and rhythmic, like a tune hummed under one's breath. A lullaby. The same song whispered by the child who never cried, the woman who never spoke, the master who begged for forgiveness too late. And though the city moved on, the people of Charleston learned to walk the long way around that part of town. The street lamps there burned dimmer, the air colder. And when the wind blew from the sea, it carried a faint melody through the trees, the song of the house that refused to let silence die. In 1870, Charleston had changed. The war had come and gone, the harbor rebuilt, and the city's fortunes shifted with the tide of history. But the Wainwright estate still stood, silent, sealed, and untouched. It had become a relic, a story whispered to frighten children and amuse travelers. Locals said the house was cursed, others said it was simply forgotten. Yet for all the years it sat in decay, no one dared to cross its threshold. That changed when the new owners of the land, a northern company seeking to develop the property, ordered it cleared. Workers arrived one humid morning, armed with hammers, saws, and the confidence of men who did not believe in ghosts. The air inside was heavy and stale, thick with the dust of 3 decades. The boards groaned underfoot, and the scent of salt and mildew lingered in every corner. The men began in the cellar, prying up the old planks and clearing debris. They found nothing at first but rot and ruin, until one of them struck something hollow beneath the stone wall. When they pulled it open, they found a space that no plan or record had ever mentioned, a narrow chamber, its entrance bricked over from the inside. The foreman sent for a lantern and stepped inside. The room was small, its walls slick with condensation, the air colder than the rest of the house. In the far corner lay a wooden chest, half buried in dirt. Inside were stacks of papers, their edges yellowed and curled with age. Letters. Each one signed in the same hand, Elias Wainwright. They were not business ledgers or correspondence. They were confessions, written to no one, meant for no eyes but his own. The first began plainly. She would not speak. No matter what I did, no word passed her lips. I offered mercy, she gave silence. I gave pain, and still she looked upon me as though I were the one chained. The men read on, their voices low, the room thick with dread. Elias wrote of Mara, the silent woman who had vanished in the summer of the great storm. He spoke of her defiance, her refusal to plead, her calm that unmade his pride. He called her disobedient, ungrateful, unholy, and yet every line betrayed a strange reverence, as though her silence had frightened him more than any curse. Then came the final page. The handwriting was different, hurried, jagged, written by a trembling hand. She defied my order and bore my shame. I could not let the city see. I begged her to speak, to repent, but she would not. Even as I took her to the earth, she said nothing. I thought her fear would break before the dark. But it did not. When I cast the last soil upon her, she looked up at me and whispered one word, soon. I have buried her beneath the foundation of my wealth. Let her silence rest there. Let it never rise. The men dropped the letters and backed away. No one spoke for a long while. The cellar seemed to breathe, slow, deep, and heavy. One of the workers swore he heard a faint hum beneath the floor, so soft he almost mistook it for his own heartbeat. By evening, the foreman ordered the chamber sealed again. The letters were handed to the sheriff, who read them once and said nothing. The official report called it madness of the old master, the ravings of a man who'd lived too long in isolation. But word spread regardless. The people of Charleston remembered the whispers, the failed auctions, the vanished guests, the lullaby that carried through the marsh wind. And now they knew. Mara had never fled. She had been there all along, beneath the walls, beneath the chains, beneath the very floors that had borne the weight of the Wainwright name. And the silence that haunted that house for generations had not been a curse at all. It had been a promise. They say the Whispering House still stands, though time has tried its best to erase it. The once white columns are blackened now, the roof bowed, the garden strangled in vines. The harbor winds beat against its walls like the pulse of a forgotten memory. No one lives there, but the city swears it's not empty. Fishermen on the late tide claim they've seen light flickering in the upper windows, a faint, wavering glow that dances to no rhythm but its own. Some say it's the reflection of lanterns on the water. Others say it's her. The woman who never spoke. The one who hums when the sea is restless. And when the night air grows still enough, when Charleston streets fall quiet beneath the weight of the tide, those who pass along the old harbor road sometimes stop, not because they see anything, but because they hear it. A woman's voice, low and steady, rising and falling with the wind. A lullaby without words. And if you listen closely, you might hear another voice answering, small, distant, almost childlike. A single whisper threading through her song. Some say it's Jonas, still calling to the mother he never knew. Others say it's the house itself, breathing, remembering, speaking back to the silence that made it. The people of Charleston learned to stop questioning what lingered there. They built new homes, paved new streets, and let the marsh reclaim the edges of the old estate. But no one ever tore it down. Perhaps out of fear. Perhaps out of respect. Perhaps because deep down, they knew what the house had become, a monument to what was hidden, a warning of what silence can bury but never erase. The story of the Wainwrights never made it into ledgers or history books. But it endures in whispers, in the wind that rattles the shutters, in the hum that rises from the water when the moon is low. She was silent in life, but not in death. Her voice lingers in the cracks of the wood and the rusted chains beneath the floor. And even now, if you stand by the harbor at night and listen long enough, you can hear it, faint, patient, eternal. Because silence, in Charleston, was never empty. It was a scream that learned to whisper.